Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 108. And I think this painting is a good depiction of holos and anholon. None of the parts of the painting does make any sense. And looking carefully, it will not even make any sense if you go into the Let's continue here, 1108, and this is so important, so I'm going back to it and there will be some commentary, but now all of Heraclitus is falling together, it's making sense. And one thing that one should not remember when it comes to Heraclitus is that understanding will not come for free. You will need to work for the understanding. And I think that is a big difference to modern philosophy. Actually, in the wake of the natural philosophers, philosophicos, it is easier. There are two reasons for that. One is that the intuition they use, the law of the excluded middle, for instance, it's fairly grounded, and intuitions you don't have to think of. They come naturally. Like speaking your own language, yeah? I would say that is a pretty adequate parallel there. And therefore, it is a great strain to learn a new language. It's an even greater strain to learn a philosopher that doesn't take as a starting point the law of the excluded middle or generalized contradictions. And those people have thought it's been tedious and boring to listening to the reading through of Kahn's Heraclitus need to understand this is much more work than ordinary philosophy. It's comparatively easy to read or understand of something that is popularly written because it uses, even if the language is very complicated and hard to understand, it has the same foundation. Whereas if you want to change the foundation, you need to put your effort to it. It is not so much by only to learn, it's de-learning as well. I think de-learning takes the most effort. Otherwise, your understanding will be the same. We discussed the other day the theorem of Gödel, and there is one understanding. You can directly understand it, and you can use language in a different way, or mathematical language in a different way, or you can go about things in a different way. That is not true. The lesson from the incompleteness on Gödel is no change to mathematics or anything at all. No change. The change is in yourself, and you will get better at things. There is a complete naivety to think that mathematics is all the same at every instant. It's a 100 observer dependent, and to get away from that generalized and unclear and school example idea, you need to put some effort, otherwise you'll be stuck in that. That's the hard truth about learning. It needs you to put your head at it. And de-learning is even tougher. It's 2,500 years of Milesian dominance of all thinking in all strata, and all what we usually think is divergent thinking. I listen to lectures now from a very, I say, one of the best lecturers in philosophers whatsoever. I don't have his name. It's part of a lecture series from the 80s. They are brilliant. He's very funny. But you understand too, all the evolving philosophers are no different according to Heraclitus. They are all exactly the same. Difference can only come not in a change of how you express yourself, because For something that is 100% clear, Heraclitus doesn't express himself in a particular way that you can imitate. He wants to give you learning, give you wisdom. He wants to give you Sophia. This is true philosophy. It's not in a particular way of expressing oneself. So you should change your language and thereafter never ever, for instance, talk about existence, or maybe you should talk about everything as processes. I've been mentioning processes or verbs. No, not at all. Had nothing at all to see with that. That's as far as you can come. There is no way of shortening Heraclitus. There is no way of expressing his thought in other words. You need to reach into the words he used. There lies understanding, and it cannot be compressed or condensated into a couple of sentences. And it takes time. If it doesn't take time, it sure as hell is not Heraclitus. A philosophy that doesn't take time, that's demolition. It's very easy to make a contradiction. You sit and play a game of contradiction in your head, and then you come to some sort of a conclusion, and then you shake your own hand and congratulate yourself of your great discovery. No, that is an analytical philosophy that tries to uphold that there are different varieties and that there is a big difference between analytical philosophy and postmodernism or post-structuralism or something like that. There's no difference at all. Different way of expressing oneself, yes, but the kernel, the flesh of it, that is not only the superficial features of the words, how you express something, in which order you express something, the very flesh of philosophy, that is different in Heraclitus. And after this rather elongated brasklapp, as we usually call it in Swedish, after the famous Bishop Brask, when Stockholm was occupied by the enemy king forced bishops and other high men and noblemen to sign an agreement, and thereby also putting their seal on a contract. He put this seal, but he put a little bit of paper under the seal that he had to do it. This is something called a brasklapp, and it's a reminder. I will go to the second paragraph, 278, and it is connected to holon and anholon, maybe one of the most interesting distinctions, and one that is more than any other distinction sort of not understood or looked into carefully within mathematics and common physics. But I start slowly here to get into the thing, otherwise it would be just too gruesome to understand. Four pairs of opposites divide into two groups. Day and night, winter and summer define the cosmic order of change and regularity within which human life is carried on. The last two pairs, war and peace, satiety and famine, represent extreme human experiences of disruption and restoration. But all four pairs are characterized by a common pattern, the alternation and interdependence of a positive and a negative term. Thus, war and famine represent things dangerous and destructive, while peace and satiety represent what is positive and desirable. A similar positive-negative contrast underlies the antithesis of the first group. Summer is the good season, kalokairi, fair weather. The ancient Theros suggest crops, whereas winter is named from storm, shemoni or shemon. Daylight stands for life, but night is the fearful power of darkness. Hence her euphemistic name, Euphroni, the kindly one, used throughout the fragments. Now the regularity of seasons and changing ratios of day and night was recognized as the very pattern of cosmic plan, the work of an ordering intellect. The full symmetry of our sentence seemed to make a similar point about the negative and positive extremes of human experience. By the measure of cosmic order, peace and war, satiety and hunger are necessarily joined together within a total unity that is the God, or the good, I would say also. But whereas other fragments asserts the unity of a specific pair of opposites, what our sentence adds is the thesis of unity for all the pairs. And I'm going to put another brasklapp here, or rather parenthesis. Modern day and age is focused on the idea that if you see good and bad, desirable and not desirable things as oppositions, you can come to the conclusion it will be better to keep one part of the opposition. Thereby you are making the pleasurable or the satiety dependent on what is not. Thereby the goodness in life is not so much goodness in itself, a sign like fire, Heraclitus mentions, but is just not bad, it's just not pain. And I think this is very common today. We see good as not bad, which is horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Then we can never have pleasure, I would say. So the year and time of pleasure, as we assume that we are situated in, is nothing of the kind, according to Heraclitus or Kahn. We're living in the bad. The thing that is before pleasure and unpleasure is much greater and is the process that makes both. You can imagine how much bigger that is, how much forceful, how much greater the pleasure can come from that. Or something bigger than pleasure, because it's just like a singularity that doesn't exclude duality or plurality. So much stronger points to singularity. And that is also why the Gödel mistake is a true mistake. Because he thinks that mathematics could be made stronger by exclusion. It is just the opposite. In practice, in theory, for the person making mathematics, it becomes so much stronger if it is let to be a process, something you do, because then you can have much more stronger staticness. The pairing of war and peace is unique, since elsewhere war stands alone for the cosmic order. We thus recognize a duality in the rule of war, which figures here as one constituent of a particular antithesis, and there as a principle of antithesis as such. Just as we have distinguish a partial and total conception of deity and a particular, elemental and universal cosmic rule for fire. There is no one term that can designate the principle of total order without ambiguity. It would be pointless to debate whether these four pairs of opposites are to be attributed to the God as predicates or strictly identified with him as an alternative description. The logical dichotomy between the is of prediction and the is of identity is a conceptual anachronism which does violence to the simple directness of Heraclitus' language. God is in some sense defined by or identified with the opposites here, though of course he cannot be identified with any one or with any pair taken alone, nor can the list be regarded as an exhaustive account of deity. The God will strictly be identical only with a total pattern of opposition. Remember that, the total pattern of opposition. Opposition itself is something that is constructed by the before. Opposition wasn't in the before, something I pointed to in the tremendous lecture 1107, which was very bad song quality, was a lot of locomotion. I think maybe the point didn't fall through, but I did have an epiphany there, and that is that the oppositions are made by that force which is before the division of good and bad, and the division can always be made in different ways. Can you now see how big is the before? And can you now also see how big is God? It's pretty tremendous compared to the daily take on both God and good. All of a sudden you can see this is a rather small good or God. Not at all as encompassing and interesting, not at all as strong. No, this is much greater. This is the wholeness as both movement and stillness. The thing that makes up stillness and movement. And I think most interpreters of Heraclitus think that he's opposing the other philosophers. Very far from it. And the conclusion often gets with Pantarei that everything is impermanence or sort of a disillusioned view of the world. That makes him a very, very small philosopher. Not even a philosopher at all. He is the only philosopher. After him, everything was just philositis, the disease of philosophizing. He was the philosopher. He is the great one. This pattern is the order of the universe, its unifying structure as a balancing of opposites over time. The God identified in fragment 123 is neither a physical substance, nor an underlying element, nor any concrete body like elemental fire. This is obvious from the first sentence, but often forgotten in the exegesis of what follows. 2. It alters as when mingled with perfumes. It gets named according to the pleasure of each. Very good. What is it that alters or becomes other in kind? Allo ios. The God surely, but not the God as some underlying subject or substrate that could manifest itself in the opposites taken one at a time, being actually and in itself an entity distinct from them all. This substratum interpretation of 123, which is encouraged by a superficial reading of the simile of incense as well as by the Aristotelian view of Heraclitean fire as material cause, is clearly ruled out by the preceding sentence. For there is no one subject which might become first day and then night, then winter or summer, war or peace. You see, what we usually refer is that these are some sort of substances and they make up the before. So put summer and winter together, we have the substance of before. We have the totality. This is not how to understand complementarity in quantum mechanics. Neither is it the way of understanding Heraclitus. And since we don't understand Heraclitus, I would say we don't understand quantum mechanics. It goes hand in hand. Days and night are themselves part of and modified by summer and winter, just as they are qualified in turn by war and peace. The four pairs of opposites are in no sense alternatives to one another, as potential attributes of some underlying subject, in a way that different fragrances may characterize a single fire. It is only between the two terms of any given pair that a change of this kind can be understood. So the word "it alters" must refer to a change from any one term to its opposites, or more generally, to every change between opposites. This is the divine structure of cosmic process according to Heraclitus. It is a misreading of the simile to suppose that there is some process by which cosmic fire might change from day to winter, from peace to famine, or from one pair of opposites to another. It's the same misreading that leads so many editors to insert fire or some other noun as subject of the clause, when it's mingled with perfume. For the altar flame is of course distinct from the incense or spices that are thrown upon it. All the more reason why Heraclitus should have avoided here any explicit mention of fire. His simile holds not between the transformations of the god and the mingling of fire with incense, but between the different manifestation of the god and the alternative naming of the fire or the god when so mingled. Maybe this could be compared to having a pantheon of gods and making one superior of them all, and then later making him more than all the other gods, and then one might make that god all that is, like Xenophanes, no other gods, or just one god. This is a hierarchy of trying to capture everything to play the contradictions oneself has constructed, so forth, making that process entirely subjective, although shared in language. This is not what Heraclitus means either. As there is one fire called by many names, so there is one divine system of unity and opposition that has just been designated by four pairs of opposites. As it stands, the subject of this clause as so of the entire second sentence, is nameless. It acquires a name only from the spices with which it's mixed and in which the namer takes pleasure. Since the remote subject of the preceding sentence is the god, and since we are given no subject here, the text suggests that it is the god himself who appears as fire mingled with incense. The cosmic god has his epiphany in the flame burning on the altar. Once the text is corrected by the editors, we find no such mysterious identity between the universal deity and the sacrificial fire. Indeed, no mystery at all, but a transparent and misleading simile. This is why Kahn is so important. Any other reading of Heraclitus will set you off in the wrong track. And it will actually, if studied enough, block the understanding of Charles H. Kahn. It will not be any return once that is established, because the moment of surprise, so to speak, is very important in Heraclitus. These things cannot be pointed out without a surprise. That's impossible. I mentioned before you need a slap over your face. The final phrase, named according to the pleasure, hedone, of each, may be read in two ways. According to an old technical use of hedone for a flavor or perfume, it means simply that the unnamed fire receives the name of each spice that is added to it. But this is not the ordinary sense of hedone. For example, in Herodotus, and even if Heraclitus alludes to this special usage here, it is difficult to believe that he meant to exclude the standard meaning of the word pleasure. On that reading, the phrase with hekasto will mean not according to the flavor of each spice, but according to the pleasure of each man, whoso names it. It is not that the naming of the divine by means of opposites is arbitrary or subjective, depending upon personal whim, but rather that the positive and negative values of opposing names are relative to the human perspective and to the personal experience of the individual. Mankind perceives the contrast, the otherness, the aloios of daylight and nocturnal darkness, hunger and surfeit, but not the unity which binds each pair together, and which is the same principle of antithesis throughout. It is the disease that makes health sweat and good, hunger satiety, weariness rest. I think for modern man the only way, according to this, to have pleasure is to expose oneself for displeasure. Maybe that's the reason for people making tattoos and forcing themselves into different things like extreme training, mountain climbing, falling from rocks, and doing other terrible things. I think the sense that the Dutch swimmer Wim Hof is taking is sensible. He likes the cold, but I think there is a lot who can only receive pleasure from having that pain. And that also goes for the thinking. As Heidegger calls Danken, doesn't exist anymore. It's just Denken. Danken is thankfulness, but it's also satisfaction. It's being happy what you have. It is santosha. And that's impossible today. And you will inflict that pain automatically to yourself by clinging to the contradiction and saying, I only eat because I don't want to be hungry, which is just distasteful. You eat because you like the food, and the food can stand for itself without excluding hunger or lack of food. Then it is whole. Only then it's complete. Then it's only good. But today nothing is wholly good. Nothing is complete. Everything is shattered. I think that's the best word. That shattering that is today, this lack of pandainai, even our own thinking is shattered, our own soul. How could anybody believe in eternal life today when we don't even have it from day to day? We can only have it from day to day by having the before, and the before cannot be talked about clearly, but it can still be talked about, as Heraclitus shows. And that has been ignored for, I would say, good reasons. Very hard not to fall into the trap. 2,500 years. What do you say? There haven't been an Heraclitean tradition. That could have killed the whole thing, maybe. Just speculation. Ignore the last one. I'm just thinking high here. I'm thinking, thinking out loud, as it says in English. Thinking high doesn't mean I take drugs. It's a Swedish saying, means tänka högt. I think that's a good pointer to. When you go into text, you lose ability to do other things. Everything becomes very cumbersome. I think we are used to a low level of energy, and therefore we cannot think. We are so used to the low level of energy, so we might even prefer it. I don't know. But at least it's habit. And habit makes people today say don't do two things at the same time. Don't be simultaneously. Don't drive a car and have a conversation. I think for good reason, because our focus is so small and so narrow. But it will also upkeep the narrowness. You see the problem here? Could be the reason why Heidegger suggested that disaster and war could be the only way to make us whole again. I don't think that's the only way, but possibly it could be the only way. I don't know. Dissatisfaction is what we feel today. Also shown by neurologists, biologists, pointed out by Ian McGilchrist, who shows dissatisfaction began already in the late 20th century. Dissatisfaction will happen, we will feel insecure, and we will become masochistic in our striving for having only pleasure. That's necessary in that game of opposition that, I think it was Arya Saimat who had a song that was, in order to understand what happiness is, I need to have pain in my life. So you can only have a short spell of happiness and then you need pain again. Welcome to the modern world. You can only have God in the church for a short while, because all the rest of the day you have disbelief. You gather with some other people, you start to hymn or sing or something like that, and you get a short satisfaction and illusory, because you don't reach into the before, the thing that will make almost unnecessary to believe in God. But definitely the blasphemous attitude that Heraclitus has also shows to the greatness of God. He's so great he cannot even be made a fool. Of course he respects God, but no point does he think that what we today see as blasphemous attitudes to the Greek gods were actually disrespectful. On the contrary. Hippolytus tells us that 123 was found in the same section as 120 to 121. This is one of the very few cases where my arrangement of the fragments rests on a documentary evidence. 124. Grasping, synapsis. We get into synapsis, we're now gone over to page 281. Wholes and not wholes, convergent, divergent, consonant, dissonant, from all things one, and from one thing all. This form of this fragment recalls the first sentence in 123. A topic is posed by the opening word, then explicated by a series of opposing terms. But whereas the surface structure of 123 was clear, with the subject, the God, singled out by a definite article, in 124 the initial term is itself enigmatic, and we scarcely know what is being asserted or what. Both in form and content, these two fragments serve as complements to one another, providing a kind of summary of Heraclitus' thought. They might well have been placed together here, at or near the end of the book. And this is why I go back to this. This summary is possible just because we've been reading carefully, trying to come to grip with Heraclitus. We've been discussing it a lot, I would say, and we've been thinking about it, been practicing it bodily, I would say, getting the opposing pairs dorsal and ventral working at the same time, which is very important. And this also bear on Bertrand Russell, Gottlob Frege, set theory, how they both fail to see that the smaller non-whole does actually point to the whole, whereas Bertrand Russell is stuck in exclusion, contradistinction, which also becomes his life, constantly changes his view to get new illusory satisfaction from life, almost like taking a happy pill or something like that, taking a drug, nothing deep or encompassing. One, as first word and the only term not paired with an antithesis, the plural form sublapsus emerges as the topic upon which the following pairs will comment. But what does this word mean? Most commentators, groping for some clue, assign to synapsis a sense that will fit the rest of the sentence. Zusammensetzung. That's Snell. Things taken together, Kirk. Connections, Markovich. Assemblages, Bollock Wismet. But none of these senses is attested for synapsis or the Attic sylepsis in archaic or classical usage. Such renderings tend to short-circuit the process of understanding by taking a point of departure and interpretation that can only be reached by an analysis of the whole sentence. Before Aristotle, for whom the word can mean biological conception or pregnancy, the only sense attested for synapsis is the bodily notion of seizing, laying hold of, arresting, apprehending. Now the cognate verb, katalepsetai, is twice used by Heraclitus in the sense of personal capture. And also elabomen and katalebomen. If we are to take Heraclitus at his word, our interpretation must begin with the literal sense of grasping or seizure, as in the capture of someone trying to escape. Commentators have generally neglected this ordinary meaning of the word because it makes 124 harder to understand, or say harder to understand from the modern mind. But whoever supposed that Heraclitus was an easy author? This initial sense of synapsis becomes less puzzling once we realize that 124 characterizes the structure of the universe, and remember that this structure is an order of justice involving punishment and reward. We are then free to connect the image of seizing a fugitive with other statements about the impossibility of escape. I would end here. I think that was an initiation without much commentary, and I will continue my commentary on the B level. Thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon. I end here with this picture.